My name is Juan Martinez. I'm a professor here for a seminary, and during this second session, we're going to be looking at the historical causes of migration from south to north in the Americas. We're going to look at the fact that the migratory patterns that we see today are closely linked to the history of the United States and its interventions in Latin America, and that the issues of migration north are also linked to how Christians have seen each other, especially Catholics in Latin America and Protestants in North America. In the first session, Dr. Garcia Johnson mentioned 5 areas that have sort of defined the unequal relationships that then lead also to the kinds of patterns we're talking about. He talked about racial ethnic tensions and definitions, where one group of people defines itself as superior to another group of people, and how that group of people sees itself with the rights to take natural resources and to take control of those natural resources for their own economic gain. And how that process then is justified through all kinds of authority mechanisms and then becomes normative and then becomes the normality. And so you're going to see that happening as we think about the migratory patterns and how the United States has intervened and has seen Latin America as its own backyard. We're going to do 3 things during our 2 sessions. One is we're going to see that migratory pattern in its historical context. We're going to think about and reflect on the logic of that expansion that has created this migratory pattern. And we want to be looking at how churches have responded to it. We're going to do it in 2 sections. We're going to go from the time of the U.S. takeover through 1965. 1965 is key because of the immigration law that was written and approved that year. And then the second section will look from 1965 to the present. Now, a couple things are in order for us to get started as we think about this. One is that we have to remember that the vast majority of immigrants from Latin America would consider themselves Christian, be they Catholic or Protestant. And amongst the Protestants, most of them today are Pentecostal. And so we've got a migration of Christians into a Christian nation. That's different than the way migration is usually presented as Muslims or others coming. It's Christians coming to a Christian nation. Now, migration affects all of the United States, but migrants, in particular those who have irregular status or undocumented, are mostly concentrated in just a few states. For example, right now, 2019, about 25% of all undocumented aliens in the United States live in the state of California. Another 16% live in Texas. And 5% live in each of Florida, New York, Illinois, and New Jersey. So just in those 6 states, you've got well over 60% of all the undocumented in the United States. Now, of those undocumented, about 75% come from Mexico and Central America and other parts of Latin America to a lesser extent. About 10% from Asia, and then the rest from the rest of the world. So we find ourselves in a situation where Latinos are the largest group of undocumented, and they're mostly concentrated in California and largely in Southern California. Now, the migratory waves that created the modern Americas were part of European expansion. We have to remember that the first migration and migratory movement that influences how we think about things today is the out-migration from Europe. Catholics from Spain and Portugal into what we now call Latin America, and Protestants mostly from England and from other Protestant nations into what we now call North America for the most part, with the French Catholics in Quebec being a major exception to that pattern. But those people migrate, they take over, they come with the intention of conquest. They see themselves as God's superior people. Both the Catholics, especially from Spain, and the Protestants from England, saw themselves as God's select people that had the right to conquer. Many times the English and later the Americans would see themselves as the new Israel that was conquering the new Canaan. So that gave them the right to impose themselves, to push away, to kill the Canaanites, if you will. But those people also brought African slaves, cheap and a workforce to the Americas, changing also that migratory pattern. So they came to in conquest, and they came imposing the slave system on the Americas and on the economy that they were establishing. Now, interestingly, both Catholics and Protestants justify all of this theologically because they are God's chosen people. Again, that ethnic, racial understanding. So then, in that environment, as the countries of the Americas become independent of the European powers, the United States becomes an expansionist country. It doesn't stay on the eastern seaboard. It wants to go from sea to shining sea, as the national hymn says it. And so first they buy land the Louisiana Purchase from the French, who had conquered it from the native peoples. They buy the Northwest Territories from England, again, that had been conquered from native peoples. But then they conquer half of Mexico's territory. In 1835, people in Texas who had become Mexican citizens, in 1836, they rebel against the Mexican government with the help of the United States and become independent, and they claim large part of the Southwest as their territory, even though they never had control of it, and most of it was Mexico. In 1846, President Polk justifies a war of invasion against Mexico, much weaker, saying that Mexico had killed American troops on American territory because it had killed troops that had come into the territory that was widely understood to be Mexican, but it justified the war. The United States entered all the way into Mexico City and then debated how much of Mexico they wanted to keep. Some people thought keeping all of Mexico. That's why it's called the United States of America. It was going to be of all the Americas. But in the U.S. Congress, famously one senator, Senator Calhoun, says, and if we take all of Mexico, what are we going to do with 6 million Indians? Again, that sense of these people are not at our level. So in the end, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, it gives, cedes all the Southwest to the United States, supposedly sold for $25 million. Of course, the United States charged Mexico $25 million for starting the war. And so, obviously, the United States did not give the Mexican government a penny for the land that it took. It will do something similar in Havana, Cuba in 1898 with Spain, sinking the ship the Maine and claiming it was Spain that did it, even though 100 years later the United States finally confessed that, in fact, it was the United States' action to justify the war. And the United States then took over Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And in 1899, Puerto Rico became a colony of the United States. So this is the pattern of first geographic intervention. The pattern of economic, political, and social intervention will continue throughout the 20th century. Such it is that Juan Gonzalez, the author, when he writes the story of Latinos in the United States, he calls it the harvest of empire. Every time the empire has expanded, one of the direct results has been migration north. So to this day, almost 2/3 of all Latinos in the United States are Mexican or Mexican descent. A significant percentage are Puerto Rican. And then others will come from other points of intervention of the United States in Latin